They said justice was blind, but in Dunwich Crossing, it only saw color. Elias Carter, a young black sharecropper, stood before Judge Horace Greeley, accused of a murder he didn't commit. The crowd cheered as the gavel fell. 3 days till hanging. No appeal, no mercy. But the night before his death, the heavens opened. Lightning struck the courthouse, and the jail burned to the ground. By morning, the town celebrated his divine punishment. They didn't know Elias had walked out of those flames alive. Years later, a stranger came back, calling himself Elijah Cross. Polite, educated, quiet. The same man they'd buried in rumor. Now buying land, building rail lines, and whispering justice into fire. One by one, the men who condemned him began to vanish. And when the judge finally looked into the eyes of the man he'd sentenced to die, he realized too late. Justice wasn't blind. It was waiting. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The courthouse of Dunwich Crossing sat like a rotting tooth in the center of town. Its white paint peeled in long strips, revealing gray wood beneath that sweated in the July heat. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to choke on. The windows stood open, but no breeze came. Only flies moved freely, landing on damp necks and sticky forearms. Inside, every bench was full. White faces pressed together, shoulder to shoulder. The men wore their Sunday shirts despite the heat. The women fanned themselves with folded newspapers. Children sat on laps or squeezed between adults, eyes wide with excitement. They had come to see justice done. They had come to watch a black man hang. Elias Carter stood in chains before them all. He was 27 years old. His hands were calloused from years of work in fields that would never be his. His clothes were simple, a gray shirt and brown pants, both worn thin. 3 days of stubble darkened his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights in a cell that stank of piss and fear. But he stood straight, his shoulders square, his chin up. Behind him, tucked in the back pew where the colored folks were allowed to sit, his mother trembled like a leaf in wind. Martha Carter wore her church dress, the black one she saved for funerals. Her hands clutched a worn Bible so tight her knuckles had gone pale. Her lips moved in silent prayer. Tears ran down her cheeks in steady streams. At the defendant's table, Thomas Wilkes shuffled papers that meant nothing. He was a thin man with watery blue eyes and a mustache that drooped over his upper lip. The court had assigned him to defend Elias. He had done nothing, asked no real questions, called no witnesses. He would not look at his client. Not now. Not ever. Judge Horace Greeley sat high above them all. He was 63 years old, with silver hair combed back from a lined forehead. His black robes hung on his frame like the wings of a vulture. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. His eyes were sharp and cold, the color of ice on winter water. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room. "This court is now in session," he said. The gavel came down once, hard. The crowd fell silent. "We are here to render judgment in the matter of the state of Mississippi versus Elias Carter, a Negro accused of the murder of Henry Dobson, a white man and respected member of this community." Elias felt the weight of every eye in the room. The trial had been a performance, a show with a script everyone already knew. The prosecutor, a fat man named Gerald Sykes, had paraded witness after witness before the jury. All white men. All liars. "I saw him running from Dobson's store with blood on his hands," one had said. "He threatened Mr. Dobson just the day before," another swore. "He's got a mean streak, that one. Always did." None of it was true. Henry Dobson had tried to force himself on Elias's mother when she came to buy flour. Elias had pulled the man off her. Dobson had grabbed a knife. They struggled. The blade ended up in Dobson's belly. An accident. Self-defense. The defense of his mother's honor. But the truth did not matter here. Thomas Wilkes had stood during his turn to speak. His voice shook. The defense rests, Your Honor. He had called no witnesses. He had presented no evidence. He sat back down and stared at his hands. The jury had deliberated for 12 minutes. 12 minutes to decide a man's life. When they returned, the foreman, a hardware store owner with a red face and thick jowls, read the verdict without hesitation. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom exploded in applause. Now Judge Greeley leaned forward in his seat. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly with a white handkerchief. The room waited. He placed the glasses back on his nose and folded his hands. "Elias Carter," he began, his voice smooth as honey, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the murder of Henry Dobson. This crime, committed against a white man, against a pillar of our community, is an affront to the natural order established by God Himself." The crowd murmured approval. "I have served this community for 30 years, the judge continued. "I have upheld the law with fairness and righteousness. I have never wavered in my duty to maintain order, to preserve the peace, to ensure that each man knows his place in God's grand design." His voice grew louder, filling the room like smoke. "You, Elias Carter, have violated that sacred order. You have raised your hand against your betters. You have shed innocent blood, and for this, there can be only one punishment." Elias felt his mother's sob from across the room. He did not turn to look at her. He kept his eyes on the judge. "It is the sentence of this court," Judge Greeley pronounced, "that you be taken from this place to the county jail, where you will be held until dawn 3 days hence. At that time, you will be led to the gallows constructed on the hill outside this town, and there you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy on your soul." The gavel struck wood like a gunshot. The crowd roared. Elias felt hands grab his arms. Deputies pulled him toward the side door. But before they could move him, something inside Elias broke open. Years of swallowed rage, decades of inherited pain. The fury of watching his mother weep while white men laughed. He turned to face the judge. "If I hang," Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "your town will hang with me." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Greeley's face darkened. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Remove him," he said quietly. The deputies yanked Elias toward the door. As he passed the front row of benches, he saw Samuel Greeley, the judge's son. The younger man was 30 years old, handsome in the way snakes are handsome, all smooth surfaces and hidden venom. He wore an expensive suit. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade. Samuel met Elias's eyes, and he smirked. That smirk said everything. It said, "You are nothing." It said, "We own you." It said, "Your suffering is our entertainment." Elias memorized that face. The deputies shoved him through the door and into the blazing heat outside. Behind him, the courthouse bells began to toll. Slow, mournful. The sound rolled across Dunwich Crossing like thunder. The sun was setting. The sky burned red behind the gallows hill. The cell beneath the courthouse was a hole carved into Mississippi clay. No windows, no light except what leaked through the gaps in the floorboards above. The walls wept moisture. The air tasted of earth and rust, and the sweat of men who had waited here to die. Elias sat on the wooden bench that served as his bed. Iron cuffs circled his wrists, connected by a short chain that clinked whenever he moved. The metal had rubbed his skin raw. Dark blood crusted around the edges where the shackles bit into flesh. 3 days. That was all the time left between him and the rope. Outside, the afternoon faded into evening. The sounds of Dunwich Crossing drifted down through the floorboards. Footsteps, laughter, the rumble of wagon wheels on dirt roads, life continuing as if his ending meant nothing. Then the first drops of rain began to fall. They pattered against the courthouse roof like fingers drumming on wood. Soft at first, tentative, then harder, faster, the rhythm building into something insistent. Elias lifted his head. He listened to the rain and thought about his mother's garden, how she would stand in summer storms with her face turned up to the sky, letting the water wash over her, how she said rain was God's way of washing the world clean. Footsteps approached his cell. A key scraped in the lock. The iron door swung open with a groan that echoed off stone walls. A young guard stepped inside, carrying a tin plate. Caleb Turner was barely 21 years old. He had pale skin that burned easy in the sun, and light brown hair that stuck up in cowlicks no matter how much he combed it. His uniform hung loose on his thin frame. The other guards called him soft. They said he would not last. Caleb set the plate on the bench beside Elias. The usual portion was 1 piece of cornbread and a cup of water. But tonight, there were 2 pieces of bread, an extra cup of water, even a small apple, bruised but whole. "Storm's coming," Caleb said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Keep faith." Elias looked at the young man's face, saw something there that did not belong in this place, something like kindness, something dangerous. "Why?" Elias asked. Caleb glanced over his shoulder toward the stairs. "Because you deserve more than what they gave you in that courtroom." He left quickly, locking the door behind him. His footsteps faded up the stairs. Elias stared at the extra bread. His throat tightened. He picked up the apple and turned it in his shackled hands. The bruises on the fruit looked like continents on a map. He ate slowly, tasting every bite. The rain grew louder. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time moved strange in the darkness. Then he heard her voice. Elias, his mother. He stood so fast the chains rattled. Martha Carter appeared at the cell door, flanked by a different guard. An older man with a gray mustache who kept his hand on his pistol. Her face was drawn. Her eyes were red from crying, but she had come. 10 minutes, the guard said. He moved to stand at the base of the stairs, giving them the illusion of privacy. Martha's hands reached through the bars. Elias pressed his own hands against hers. The iron cuffs clinked against the cell door. Her skin was warm, soft, real. "Baby?" she whispered. Her voice broke on the word. "I'm all right, Mama. Don't lie to your mother." She squeezed his fingers tight. They gonna... She could not finish the sentence. Elias leaned his forehead against the bars. "I know. I prayed," Martha said. "Lord knows I prayed. Asked God to show mercy, to show them the truth, to open their hearts. God ain't listening to us, Mama. Don't say that." Her voice turned sharp, strong. "Don't you dare say that. God listens to everyone, even when we don't understand His plan. His plan is to let me hang for defending you." Martha flinched like he had struck her. She released his hands and stepped back. Then she began to sing. Her voice was thin at first, shaking with grief, but as she sang, it grew steadier, stronger. The hymn was old, older than slavery, older than this country, a song about rivers and promised lands and crossing over. Elias closed his eyes and listened. He let his mother's voice fill the cell. Let it push back the darkness. Let it remind him that somewhere, somehow, there was still beauty in the world. When the song ended, Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You hold on to who you are," she said. "No matter what they do to you, you hold on." "Time's up," the guard said from the stairs. Martha reached through the bars one last time. She touched Elias's cheek. "I love you, baby." "I love you too, Mama." Then she was gone. The cell door remained locked. The darkness pressed in again. Elias sat back down on the bench, and stared at nothing. Outside, the storm built. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled through the streets. Thunder rolled across the sky like God moving furniture in heaven. Elias listened to it all and thought about his mother's hymn, about crossing over, about rivers. He knelt on the cold stone floor, his knees pressed into dirt and damp. The chains dragged at his wrists. He did not pray for mercy. He had stopped believing in mercy the moment Judge Greeley's gavel fell. Instead, he prayed for meaning. "If I die," he whispered into the darkness, "let it mean something. Let it count. Let it matter." Thunder answered him. It sounded like cannon fire, like the earth splitting open, like the voice of something ancient and angry. Midnight approached. The storm grew worse. Rain pounded the courthouse until the building shook. Wind rattled the doors. Lightning turned the darkness into brief, blinding white. Then, the world exploded. A crack like the end of everything. A flash so bright it burned through the floorboards. Elias threw his arms over his face. The smell of burning wood filled his nose. Fire. Smoke poured down from above. It filled the cell in seconds, thick and black and choking. Elias coughed. His eyes watered. He could not breathe. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. "Fire! Fire!" Guards shouting, running. The crash of doors thrown open. The sound of men fleeing for their lives. Then, quiet. Elias pressed himself against the cell door. Heat radiated from above. The smoke grew thicker. He could hear the fire eating the courthouse, could hear wood cracking and splitting, could hear the rain still falling outside. A key scraped in the lock. The cell door swung open. Caleb stood there, his face streaked with soot and sweat. His eyes were wide with fear. He held a ring of keys in one shaking hand. He did not speak. He grabbed Elias's wrists and unlocked the cuffs. The shackles fell away with a clang. "Go," Caleb said. Then he turned and ran. Elias stumbled into the corridor. Smoke filled his lungs. Fire raged above his head, eating through the ceiling. Embers rained down like burning snow. He could not see, could barely breathe. He dropped to his hands and knees and crawled. The stone floor was hot beneath his palms. His eyes burned. His chest screamed for air. He crawled toward a rectangle of gray light, the exterior door, left open by the fleeing guards. He reached it, pulled himself through, collapsed onto wet grass. Rain pounded his back. It soaked his clothes. It washed the soot from his face. He gasped and coughed and sucked in air that tasted like heaven. Behind him, the courthouse groaned. Elias rolled onto his side just in time to see the roof cave in. Flames shot into the sky. Sparks swirled in the wind like angry stars. The town bells clanged wildly, rung by hands trying to raise the alarm. He dragged himself to his feet. His legs barely held him. Burns covered his arms. His hair was singed, but he was alive. He stumbled toward the river, toward the darkness beyond the burning building, toward whatever came next. The rain came down harder. The storm raged, and somewhere in the chaos, Elias Carter disappeared. The morning sun rose pale and weak over Dunwich Crossing. Smoke still drifted from the courthouse ruins, hanging in the air like a shroud. The building's walls stood blackened and crumbling. The roof was gone completely, reduced to charred beams and ash. Water from last night's storm pooled in the foundation, reflecting the gray sky. People gathered in the street to stare. They came in clusters, families, shop owners, farmers who had driven in from the surrounding land. They stood with their arms crossed or their hands clasped before them. Some shook their heads. Others whispered behind their palms. "Whole place gone," said a woman in a blue dress. "Lightning strike," her husband replied. "Direct hit to the roof. Divine judgment," someone else murmured. The whispers spread through the crowd like ripples on water. Divine judgment, God's wrath. cleansing fire. The words twisted and changed as they passed from mouth to mouth until everyone seemed to agree on one thing. The murderer had burned in his cell. "Fitting end," said an old man with tobacco-stained teeth. "Saved us the cost of rope." A younger man beside him nodded. "Reckon God wanted it that way." Justice, one way or another. The crowd parted as Judge Horace Greeley emerged from the street corner. He wore a black suit despite the heat, perfectly pressed. His silver hair was combed back from his high forehead. His face was calm, composed, but something moved behind his eyes, something that did not match the rest of him. He climbed onto a scorched piece of foundation that still stood waist-high. The crowd fell silent. "My fellow citizens," the judge began. His voice carried across the street without effort. "Last night we witnessed a terrible tragedy. This courthouse, which has served our community for 30 years, has been reduced to ruins." He paused. "Let the silence settle. But we must also recognize providence when we see it." He spread his hands wide. "The criminal who was to hang at dawn has received his sentence nonetheless. Divine justice has cleansed this land of his presence. The Lord works in ways we cannot always comprehend, but we must accept his wisdom." A few people in the crowd nodded. Some murmured agreement, but Judge Greeley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His fingers curled at his sides. For just a moment, something like doubt crossed his features, or perhaps fear. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "We will rebuild," he continued. "We will construct a new courthouse, a stronger one, and we will continue to uphold the law of this land as we always have." The crowd applauded. The judge stepped down from his makeshift platform. As he walked back toward his carriage, his son Samuel appeared at his elbow. "You think he's really dead?" Samuel asked quietly. "Of course," Judge Greeley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Where else would he be?" Samuel said nothing. They climbed into the carriage together and rode away from the ruins. Behind them, the townspeople continued to gossip and stare at the blackened walls. None of them noticed the empty cell in the basement. None of them saw the unlocked shackles lying in the ash. Miles away, deeper than most men dared to travel, the swamp stretched like a dark mirror beneath the trees. Cypress roots twisted through black water. Spanish moss hung from branches like funeral veils. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. Elias opened his eyes to unfamiliar ceiling beams. His whole body ached. Burns throbbed on his arms and chest. His throat felt raw. His head pounded with fever. He tried to sit up and immediately fell back against the thin mattress beneath him. "Easy now." A hand pressed gently on his shoulder. "You ain't ready to move yet." Elias turned his head. An older man sat beside the bed on a wooden stool. He had skin the color of deep mahogany and hair gone completely white. Deep lines creased his face around his eyes and mouth. He wore simple clothes, cotton shirt, canvas pants, and a wooden cross hung on a leather cord around his neck. "Where?" Elias's voice came out as a rasp. "Hollow Bend," the man said. "My name's Jonah Pierce. Reverend Jonah Pierce, though I don't put much stock in titles." He reached for a tin cup on a nearby table and held it to Elias's lips. "Drink!" The water was cool and clean. Elias drank until his throat felt less like sandpaper. "How'd I get here?" "My boys found you 3 days ago," Jonah said. "You were half drowned in the river shallows, burning with fever, talking out of your head about fire and judgment. We brought you here." Elias looked around the small room. The walls were made of cypress planks, fitted tight against the weather. A single window showed trees and water beyond. He could hear voices outside, the sound of axes biting wood, children laughing. "What is this place?" "A settlement," Jonah said simply. "Folks like us, freedmen and women, who needed somewhere safe to build a life. We've been here almost 10 years now." He stood and walked to the window. "The swamp keeps most white folks away. They think it's cursed, haunted. We let them think that. Why help me? Jonah turned back to him. His eyes were kind but piercing. They seemed to look straight through skin and bone to something deeper. Because the Lord gave you back your life for a reason, Jonah said. Don't matter if it was lightning or luck or something else entirely. You walked out of that fire when you should have died. That means something. Elias closed his eyes. He saw flames eating through the ceiling, felt smoke filling his lungs, heard the crash of the collapsing roof. When he opened his eyes again, his hands were shaking. I remember burning, he whispered. You got scars that'll prove it, Jonah said. But scars just mean you survived. Over the following days, Elias's strength returned slowly. Jonah tended his burns with salves made from swamp plants, fed him thin soups and cornbread, let him rest when the fever spiked and sweat soaked through his sheets. When Elias could finally walk, Jonah showed him the settlement. Hollow Bend was built on a ridge of high ground deep in the swamp. 20 families lived here in simple cabins. They grew vegetables in gardens carved from the wilderness, fished the dark waters, hunted deer and wild pigs. They had a smokehouse, a communal cook fire, a small chapel built from cypress logs. Children ran between the cabins, their laughter bright against the somber landscape. Women tended gardens and hung laundry on lines strung between trees. Men worked in the fields or repaired boats at the water's edge. It was hidden, secret, free. Elias began helping in the fields. The work was hard, but familiar. He knew how to swing a hoe, how to pull weeds, how to coax life from stubborn soil. But the smell of wood smoke from the cook fire made his hands shake, made him see flames every time he closed his eyes. One evening, as the sun sank toward the horizon, Jonah found him sitting alone by the water's edge. The Reverend lowered himself onto a fallen log beside him. For a long time, neither man spoke. They watched dragonflies skim the water's surface, listened to frogs beginning their twilight chorus. Finally, Jonah broke the silence. What you planning to do next? Elias stared across the dark water. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a thin column of smoke still rose from Dunwich Crossing. The courthouse ruins still smoldered. The town still stood. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. If justice won't come down from heaven, Elias said quietly, I'll bring it up from the earth. The firelight from Hollow Bend's cook fire reflected in his eyes, twin points of burning orange. Shadows gathered around them as night fell over the swamp. The darkness pressed close, and somewhere in that darkness, something ancient and patient began to wake. 5 years had passed since the fire. 5 years of rain and sun and seasons turning over Dunwich Crossing like pages in a book no one bothered to read carefully. The town had rebuilt itself the way a body grows new skin over a wound. The surface looked clean. Underneath, the scar tissue remained. The new courthouse stood 3 stories tall on the same foundation where the old one had burned. Brick instead of wood this time. White columns flanked the entrance like sentries. The town council had commissioned it with pride, calling it a symbol of permanence and progress, of civilization reclaimed from chaos. Main Street bustled with commerce. A new bank had opened. A hotel with actual wallpaper in the rooms. 3 churches competed for souls every Sunday morning. The Cotton Gin ran 6 days a week. Merchants argued over prices while their wives gossiped in the general store. Children chased hoops down the dirt roads. Everything appeared normal, prosperous, forgiven. Early morning mist clung to the railroad tracks on the eastern edge of town. The depot was small but serviceable. A covered platform and a ticket office painted green. A water tower stood nearby like a patient giant. The tracks stretched away in both directions, connecting Dunwich Crossing to Jackson in the north and smaller towns to the south. The morning train arrived exactly on schedule. Its whistle cut through the mist. Steam hissed from beneath the engine. Brakes squealed against iron wheels. The few passengers waiting on the platform gathered their belongings. A man stepped down from the third car. He wore a well-tailored suit, the color of charcoal. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. A leather satchel hung from his shoulder. His hat sat at a precise angle on his head. He moved with quiet confidence, neither hurried nor hesitant. His skin was the deep brown of turned earth, and his eyes were calm and intelligent behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked like a businessman, a professional man, someone who belonged in boardrooms and legal offices, someone who commanded respect through competence rather than noise. None of the white men on the platform gave him a second glance beyond the usual suspicion reserved for any black stranger in town. None recognized the burn scars hidden beneath his collar. None knew the name Elias Carter. They only knew what he told them. "Elijah Cross," he said when the station master approached. His voice was educated, clear. The accent belonged to no particular place. "I have an appointment with Mayor Greeley at 9 o'clock. The station master consulted his pocket watch. "You got time to spare. Town hall's up Main Street. Can't miss it. Big brick building with the bell tower." "Thank you." Elijah tipped his hat and walked into the morning. Dunwich Crossing had grown since he last saw it from the inside. New buildings lined streets that had been half empty before. He walked past the bank, past the hotel, past the general store where Henry Dobson had once worked before his death, became the excuse for everything that followed. His footsteps made no sound on the wooden boardwalk. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes took in every detail, every face, every shop front and alley. He was mapping the town the way a general maps a battlefield, memorizing the terrain, noting the weak points. He passed the rebuilt courthouse and paused briefly at its steps. The gallows hill rose beyond it, the structure itself long gone, but the earth still bare where it had stood. Flowers wouldn't grow there anymore. Everyone said so. Some claimed it was cursed ground. Others blamed poor soil. No one wanted to examine why. Town Hall was smaller than the courthouse, but equally proud of itself. Inside, a secretary directed Elijah to the mayor's office on the second floor. The walls were decorated with photographs of Dunwich Crossing through the years. Elijah studied them while he waited. The town in 1870, in 1880, in 1891, before the fire. The images showed a place that believed deeply in its own permanence. "Mr. Cross," the secretary gestured toward the open door, "Mayor Greeley will see you now." Samuel Greeley had aged well. He was 33 now, with his father's height and bearing but more muscle in his shoulders. His hair was still dark, his jaw was clean-shaven. He wore success like a coat tailored specifically for him. When he smiled, it looked genuine. When he shook hands, his grip was firm but not crushing. "Mr. Cross, welcome to Dunwich Crossing." Samuel gestured to a leather chair. "I received your letters. Very impressive proposal." "Thank you, Mayor Greeley." Elijah settled into the chair, crossing one leg over the other. "I represent a consortium of northern investors interested in expanding rail access throughout Mississippi. Your town is positioned perfectly for a secondary spur line that would connect directly to Memphis." "Memphis?" Samuel's eyes lit with interest. "That would triple our shipping capacity." "At minimum." Elijah opened his satchel and produced a rolled document. "I've prepared preliminary surveys and cost estimates. The investment would be substantial, but the returns would benefit everyone. Your merchants, your farmers, your tax base." They discussed routes and easements, costs and timelines. Samuel asked intelligent questions. Elijah provided detailed answers. They spoke the language of commerce and progress, two educated men planning a mutually beneficial future. Neither acknowledged the absurdity of a black man and a white mayor negotiating as equals. The new century was coming. Things were changing, slowly, in some places. And Elijah Cross presented himself as exactly the kind of respectable, educated Negro that white progressives liked to point to as proof that cooperation was possible. Samuel never noticed the way Elijah's fingers tightened when he mentioned his father, never saw the brief flash in his eyes when the courthouse bells rang noon. "I'll need to present this to the council," Samuel said finally, "but I think they'll be very interested. Can you stay in town a few days? I've taken a room at the hotel." Elijah stood and offered his hand again. "I look forward to your response." After leaving Town Hall, Elijah walked back toward Main Street, but his path took him past a large house set back from the road behind iron gates. A covered porch wrapped around three sides. Oak trees provided shade. Everything about it spoke of old money and older pride. An elderly man sat in a rocking chair on the porch. His hair was completely white now. His face was thinner than it had been 5 years ago. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on the chair's arms, but his eyes were still sharp, still watchful. Judge Horace Greeley observed the well-dressed stranger walking past his property. Something about the man's bearing caught his attention. The way he moved, the set of his shoulders. The judge had spent decades studying people, reading guilt and innocence in body language and facial expressions. This stranger moved like someone carrying weight no one else could see. Their eyes met briefly through the iron fence. Elijah nodded respectfully and kept walking. The judge's rocking chair stopped moving. He sat very still, watching until the stranger disappeared around a corner. Inside, something stirred. A memory, a shadow. But the judge was old and ill now. His thoughts often wandered. He dismissed the feeling and returned to his newspaper. Elijah continued through town until he reached a vacant lot at the edge of the commercial district. Weeds grew through cracked foundation stones. Blackened bricks still marked where walls had stood. Most of the debris had been cleared away years ago, but the ground remained empty. No one wanted to build on the old jail site. Bad luck, they said. Haunted, others whispered. A sign advertised the property for sale. Elijah copied the agent's information into a small notebook. Then he walked to the center of the lot, where the cells had once been, where he had spent his last night as Elias Carter before the fire transformed him into something else. The sun was setting now. Long shadows stretched across the ruined foundation. The town's evening bells rang, calling people home to supper. Lamplight began to glow in windows along Main Street. Elijah knelt and pressed his palm flat against a piece of scorched brick half buried in the soil. It was still warm from the day's heat, or perhaps from something deeper, something that had never stopped burning. He closed his eyes, felt the rough texture against his skin, remembered chains, remembered smoke, remembered the moment between dying and choosing not to. His lips barely moved. The words were soft enough that even someone standing beside him wouldn't have heard clearly. We begin where it ended. The cicadas rose in the trees around the lot. Their sound swelled like a chorus, like voices singing in a language older than any courthouse or gallows. The day died around him, bleeding red into purple into black. And in the gathering darkness, Elijah Cross remained kneeling on the ground where Elias Carter should have burned to death. Tomorrow, he would buy this land. Tomorrow, he would smile and shake hands and speak of progress and prosperity. Tomorrow, he would continue building the careful fiction of who he pretended to be. But tonight, in this moment, he was only himself, a dead man who had learned patience, who had learned to wait, who had learned that justice delayed was not justice denied, merely justice perfected. The cicadas sang louder. The darkness deepened. And somewhere in the distance, the town slept peacefully, unaware that the past had returned to collect what it was owed. The sound of hammers echoed through the morning air. Men called to each other across the construction site, their voices mixing with the rasp of saws cutting through fresh lumber. The old jail lot, empty and cursed for 5 years, had finally found purpose again, or so the town believed. Elijah Cross stood at the edge of the foundation, reviewing blueprints with his foreman. Dust covered his boots. Sweat dampened his collar despite the early hour. He looked every bit the businessman overseeing his investment. Professional, focused, completely unremarkable. The workers were all black men from Hollow Bend and the surrounding settlements. They'd arrived in groups of 3 and 4 over the past weeks, drawn by word of steady pay and fair treatment. Most construction in Dunwich Crossing paid black laborers half what white men earned, if it paid them at all. Elijah Cross paid the same as northern contractors. The men noticed. They appreciated it. They worked harder because of it. Foundations solid, Mr. Cross, said the foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Isaac, who'd been a carpenter before the war. Ready for the frame whenever you give the word. Good. Elijah traced a line on the blueprint. The basement needs to be deeper than standard. We'll be storing records and documents. They need protection from flood and fire. Isaac nodded. How deep you want it? 8 feet below grade. Stone walls. Reinforced door. I want anything stored down there to survive another 100 years. That's serious construction. This railway office will serve Dunwich Crossing for generations. Elijah rolled up the blueprints. We build it right the first time. He walked among the workers, greeting them by name, asking about their families, making sure they had water in the heat. The men respected him, trusted him. They had no idea that Elias Carter had ever existed. To them, he was simply Mr. Cross, a northern businessman who treated them like human beings instead of tools. Only Reverend Jonah Pierce knew the truth. He came by the site occasionally, ostensibly to check on his parishioners. In reality, he brought Elijah information, names of families who'd lost land, details of suspicious transactions, stories whispered in quarters where white ears never reached. By late afternoon, the basement walls were already taking shape. The workers had excavated deep into the earth, exposing soil that hadn't seen daylight since before the jail was built. They laid stones with practiced efficiency, building walls that would outlast everyone currently breathing Dunwich air. Elijah descended into the pit as the sun began its decline. The temperature dropped noticeably below ground level. The stone walls were cool to the touch, damp. The smell reminded him of the cell where he'd waited to die. But this time, he was the one building the prison. You planning to store gold down here, Mr. Cross? One of the workers joked. Something more valuable. Elijah ran his hand along the stone. Truth has weight. It needs a strong foundation. The man laughed, not understanding. None of them did. That was fine. They didn't need to understand. They just needed to build exactly what he specified. Every detail mattered. Every measurement served a purpose they couldn't see. By the following week, the basement was complete. The building rising above it looked like any commercial structure. Practical. Functional. The ground floor would house offices and a waiting area. The second floor would contain Elijah's private workspace. But the real work would happen below, where the stone walls were thickest, and the single door was reinforced with iron bars. Late one night, Elijah returned alone. He carried a heavy satchel and moved through the darkness without a lantern until he reached the basement. Only then did he light a small oil lamp. The room was exactly as he'd designed it. Shelves lined the walls. A heavy desk sat in the center. Locked cabinets waited in the corners. To anyone glancing inside, it would look like a proper archive for railway documents and contracts. Elijah opened his satchel and began removing its contents. Not railway papers. These were older, more fragile. Land deeds with forged signatures. Tax records showing properties seized without cause. Letters written by Judge Greeley to other officials, discussing how to legally steal freedmen's land through deliberate confusion and manufactured debt. He'd been collecting these for months. Some came from Hollow Bend families who'd saved them as proof of theft. Others he'd copied from town hall records during supposedly innocent visits to discuss railway easements. A few he'd purchased from clerks whose loyalty was negotiable when white employers paid them almost nothing. Each document went into a specific folder. Each folder received a label written in neat script. The archive grew slowly, methodically. Every crime catalogued. Every theft documented. Every victim's name recorded. The lamp flickered. Shadows danced on the stone walls. Elijah worked in silence, his movements precise and unhurried. He had time now, all the time in the world. The town thought him a bringer of progress. They had no idea he was building a monument to their sins. When the shelves were partially filled, he locked the basement door and climbed back to ground level. Through the window, he could see Dunwich Crossing sleeping peacefully. Lamplight glowed in Judge Greeley's mansion. The courthouse stood dark and proud against the night sky. Everything looked permanent, unshakable, eternal. Elijah sat at the unfinished desk on the second floor and pulled out paper and ink. He wrote carefully, his penmanship educated and flowing. The letter began formally, addressing the editor of the Jackson Courier. It was signed with a pseudonym, a concerned citizen. The letter detailed specific land transactions, provided dates and property descriptions, named Judge Greeley directly, and quoted from documents that should have been sealed court records. It asked pointed questions about how a judge could legally acquire so much freedmen's land immediately after emancipation. It suggested someone investigate before more families lost their homes to legal theft disguised as justice. He sealed the letter and set it aside. Tomorrow it would be posted from 3 towns away. The week after, another letter would go to a different newspaper. Then another, and another. A slow drip of exposure that would gradually erode the judge's reputation. Elijah had learned patience in Hollow Bend, had learned that revenge rushed was revenge wasted. The judge had taken everything from him in a single afternoon. Elijah would take everything from the judge inch by inch, day by day, until the old man understood what it felt like to watch your entire world collapse while being powerless to stop it. He worked until midnight, writing 3 more letters to different publications. Each revealed a different piece of corruption. Each came from a different concerned citizen. By the time newspapers began connecting the dots, the pattern would be undeniable. A sound outside stopped his hand mid-sentence. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a steady pace down Main Street. Elijah rose and moved to the window, staying in shadow. 6 riders carried torches. At their head rode Sheriff Tobias Crow, recognizable even at this distance by his bulk and aggressive posture. The other men were deputies and town enforcers. They rode slowly, deliberately, their torches casting wild shadows on the buildings they passed. They weren't heading anywhere specific. This was a patrol, a show of force, a reminder that the law in Dunwich Crossing belonged to certain men who expected certain people to remember their place. Elijah watched them pass, recognized 2 of the men from his trial. One had testified that he'd seen Elias running from the store. Another had been on the jury that took 15 minutes to decide his fate. The riders moved past the construction site without stopping. Their torchlight flickered across the unfinished building, across the foundation where the old jail had stood. But they didn't see what was being built there, didn't understand that the ground they'd tried to bury their crimes in was now giving birth to something that would swallow them whole. Sheriff Crow looked toward the building briefly. His face was hard in the torchlight. Suspicious. Judge Greeley had obviously told him to watch this cross fellow, to find something wrong, to discover a reason to run him out of town before he became too established. The horses continued down the street. Their hoofbeats faded gradually. The torchlight diminished until darkness reclaimed the night. Soon the only sound was wind moving through the construction site, rattling loose boards and whistling through unfinished walls. Elijah remained at the window, watching the direction they'd gone. His expression was calm, thoughtful. His hands didn't shake. His breathing stayed even. He showed no fear because he felt none. These men had already done their worst to him, had already killed him once. What could they possibly do to a dead man who'd learned how to walk again? His lips moved, forming words so quiet they barely disturbed the air. They still hunt ghosts they already buried. The sound of hooves faded completely into the dark. 3 days passed in careful routine. Elijah Cross continued his businessman facade, meeting with town officials about railway specifications, discussing timber contracts and land surveys. During the day, he was everything Dunwich Crossing wanted him to be: professional, deferential, useful. But at night, the letters continued. More newspapers, more evidence, the drip of exposure becoming a steady flow. On the third evening, Elijah was reviewing property maps in his office when the first screams reached him, distant, faint, coming from the direction of the river where the black quarters sprawled in ramshackle clusters. He stood immediately, moving to the window. Orange light flickered against the sky, not the soft glow of hearth fires. This was brighter, wilder, growing, fire. Elijah grabbed his coat and ran. His careful businessman's walk abandoned, his measured steps replaced by the desperate sprint of someone who already knew what he'd find, but refused to believe it until his eyes confirmed the worst. The streets were mostly empty. White folks stayed indoors when trouble visited the quarters. Only a few curious faces appeared in windows, watching the distant flames with the casual interest of spectators at a theater production. By the time Elijah reached the riverbank, the black quarters were already consumed. Not one building, not two. Every structure, every home, every church, all burning simultaneously in a pattern that couldn't possibly be accident. The screams had mostly stopped. Those who'd escaped stood in huddled groups along the water's edge, some still clutching children or hastily grabbed possessions. Most had nothing but their clothes. Their faces reflected firelight and horror in equal measure. Sheriff Crow sat on horseback at a safe distance, watching. Behind him, 6 deputies, the same men who'd ridden past Elijah's construction site 3 nights ago. Their torches were gone now, but their hands still smelled of kerosene. "Runaway fire," Crow announced to no one in particular. His voice carried across the water. "Unfortunate accident. Folks should be more careful with their cooking fires." It was dusk. Nobody had been cooking. The lie was so transparent it barely qualified as deception. More like a dare, a challenge. Crow's eyes swept the survivors, waiting for someone to contradict him, waiting for an excuse to do more damage. Elijah moved among the survivors, helping where he could. A woman clutched a burned child. An old man coughed black smoke from his lungs. Families searched frantically for missing members. "Where's Reverend Pierce?" someone asked. The question rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Eyes searched. The Reverend wasn't among the survivors. Elijah's chest tightened. He looked back at the flames. The church had stood at the center of the quarters. It was now completely engulfed, the steeple collapsing inward as timbers gave way. He started toward the fire. Someone grabbed his arm. "You can't go in there. Roof's already fallen." Elijah pulled free and kept walking. The heat intensified with each step. Smoke filled his lungs. His eyes watered. Through the flames, he could see the church's foundation, could see a shape that might have been a man. Might have been the Reverend who'd saved his life 5 years ago. Hands pulled him back. Multiple people this time, stronger, more insistent. "He's gone. Nothing you can do." Elijah stopped fighting, stood watching as the last walls collapsed, watched the fire consume everything, watched until the flames began to die down, and only coals remained. The survivors dispersed slowly, seeking shelter with families outside the quarters or huddling together in the woods. Sheriff Crow and his men rode away before midnight, their work complete. The fire burned itself out by dawn, leaving nothing but ash and stone foundation. Elijah stayed through the night. As the sun rose, he began searching the ruins, found what he was looking for in what remained of the church. The body was badly burned but identifiable by the silver cross the Reverend always wore. The same cross he'd shown Elijah during their first meeting. The same cross he'd held while praying over Elijah's fever wounds. Others came to help. They carried the Reverend's body to higher ground, found 3 more victims in the ruins, an elderly woman, 2 children who hadn't escaped fast enough. Elijah dug the graves himself, refused all offers of assistance, worked through the morning and into the afternoon, his hands blistering around the shovel handle. The soil was soft near the river. Easy digging. He went deep anyway. Wanted to make sure the graves would last, would mark this place permanently. As he lowered Reverend Pierce into the earth, he spoke quietly. "You gave me life. I'll give you peace." He filled the grave carefully, patted the soil smooth, fashioned a simple cross from charred timbers. Others buried their dead nearby. A small cemetery growing where homes had stood, where children had played, where prayers had been offered and songs had been sung. Elijah had collected evidence throughout the morning. Scraps of torn fabric that smelled like kerosene, boot prints that matched deputy issue, testimony from survivors who'd seen the riders arrive, who'd heard the sheriff order his men to spread the fire, who'd watched as every exit was systematically blocked. Enough evidence to bring charges, to demand investigation, to force justice through proper channels. He gathered it all together as the sun began its descent, spread the papers on a flat stone, looked at them for a long time. Names, dates, witnesses, everything needed to make a case before a court of law. Then he struck a match. The papers caught quickly, evidence becoming ash, truth transforming into smoke. He watched until every document was consumed. Then he gathered the ashes and brought them to the graves, dug a small hole and poured them in, covered them with the same soil that held Reverend Pierce. The law had killed him once, had sentenced an innocent man to hang, had stolen land and destroyed lives and called it justice. He'd been a fool to think it could be wielded against itself, to think exposing crimes would matter when the criminals controlled every courtroom and every badge. The graves stood in a neat row as twilight approached. Elijah knelt before the last one, before Reverend Pierce's final resting place. The cross cast a long shadow across the fresh-turned earth. His voice was soft, barely audible, but the words carried weight that volume could never achieve. "You told me to sow crops." He stood slowly, lit a small lantern against the gathering darkness. "Now I'll sow justice." He turned and walked into the night. The lantern light grew smaller, dimmer, until it disappeared completely, and only darkness remained where the quarters had stood. The smoke appeared at dawn, not from the river this time. From the hills north of town, where Greeley land stretched across 3 counties, where the family's wealth sat in barns and mills, and warehouses full of cotton waiting for rail transport. The first alarm came from a farmhand running into town, breathless and ash-streaked. "Fire at the grain barn! The whole north field's burning." Men rushed to help, found the barn fully engulfed, the grain stores destroyed. By the time they contained it, a second alarm reached them. The lumber mill near Cypress Creek, also burning. By noon, 5 separate fires had consumed Greeley property across the county. Not homes, not churches, barns, storage facilities, the cotton gin. Each one calculated to destroy wealth without taking lives. Each one started in multiple locations simultaneously, ensuring the fires spread too fast to stop. Sheriff Crow organized bucket brigades, sent deputies racing between sites. But the fires had too much of a head start. Too much planning behind them. By the time help arrived, only smoking ruins remained. The telegraph office discovered their lines cut around mid-afternoon. Clean cuts. Professional. Someone who knew exactly which wires mattered most. Dunwich Crossing was isolated from the outside world. No way to call for help or report what was happening. Judge Greeley stood on his porch, watching smoke rise from his destroyed mill. His face had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cane. "This is deliberate," he said to no one in particular. "This is war." Samuel paced behind him like a caged animal. His earlier confidence had evaporated, his swagger replaced by frantic energy. "We need to act. Round up every Negro within 5 miles. Question them. Find out who's behind this." The judge shook his head slowly. "You think this is random rabble? This is planned, coordinated. Someone studied us, learned our property locations, mapped our vulnerabilities. Then we find him and string him up. With what evidence? What witnesses?" The judge's voice carried exhaustion. "We can't even send word to Jackson. We're cut off." Samuel slammed his fist against the porch rail. "Then we make an example. Hang enough of them, and the responsible party will either confess or run. And if he doesn't?" The judge turned to face his son. "If he's patient enough to watch you murder innocent people and still continue his campaign, what then?" The question hung between them. Samuel had no answer. His solution required his enemy to value other lives more than vengeance, required him to break under pressure, required him to be someone other than whoever was methodically dismantling their world. The courthouse became the center of nervous activity. Men with rifles gathered. Deputies posted guards. Mayor Samuel ordered every black resident brought in for questioning. They found nobody. The quarters were still abandoned from the fire. Those who'd escaped had scattered to other counties or melted into the woods. The few who remained were elderly or infirm, clearly incapable of the coordinated assault being waged. As evening approached, Sheriff Crow sent a deputy to check the jail cells, make sure everything was secure. The deputy's screams brought everyone running. Crow hung in the center cell, not in the corner, not against a wall, suspended from the ceiling beam with rope under his arms, positioned perfectly so anyone entering would see him immediately. He was dead. Had been for hours based on the body's condition. The cell door stood open. No signs of struggle. No indication how the killer had entered or escaped. Around Crow's neck hung a wooden placard, Simple Pine, neatly carved. The words burned into the wood with precise lettering, "Fair trial." The deputies cut him down quickly, covered the body, but the damage was done. Word spread through town within the hour. The sheriff, the man who'd enforced every harsh law, who'd beaten and killed and terrorized with impunity, hanged in his own jail, in the same cells where he'd tortured prisoners. Judge Greeley arrived as they were removing the body, stood in the cell doorway staring at the rope, at the placard. His face showed recognition, understanding. The message wasn't subtle. This was judgment. Someone was systematically trying every man involved in Elias Carter's conviction. "Post guards," he ordered. "Triple watch rotation. Nobody enters this building without authorization." But his voice lacked conviction. Guards hadn't saved the barns, hadn't saved the mill, hadn't saved his sheriff. Whatever was hunting them moved through Dunwich Crossing like smoke through screens, present everywhere and tangible nowhere. Samuel wanted to organize search parties, wanted to burn the woods, wanted to do something violent and visible that would make him feel powerful again. The judge forbade it. "We conserve our strength, protect what matters. Wait for them to make a mistake." "They've already made one," Samuel insisted. "They've declared themselves our enemies. That's enough." "No," the judge said quietly. "That's what they want. They want us desperate, want us lashing out blindly, want us to become the monsters we've always been, in private made public through panic." Night fell over Dunwich Crossing like a shroud. Extra guards patrolled the streets. Nervous men clutched rifles. Windows stayed lit long past normal bedtime. The town that had slept soundly for generations now lay awake, wondering what dawn would bring. Miles away, hidden in a cabin so deep in the bayou that even hunters avoided it, Elijah Cross sat at a rough wooden table. A map of Dunwich Crossing spread before him. Property boundaries, family connections, business relationships, the complete anatomy of Judge Greeley's power. He held a piece of charcoal, used it to draw X marks through locations on the map. The grain barn, the lumber mill, the cotton gin, the telegraph office, the jail. 5 marks, 5 targets eliminated. His other hand rested on a sheet of paper. Names written in careful script. 12 men. The jury that convicted him. The witnesses who lied. The officials who sentenced him. The enforcers who carried out the town's violence. Sheriff Crow's name already had a line drawn through it. Elijah picked up a knife. Not for violence, just to sharpen. The rhythmic scrape of blade against whetstone filled the small cabin. Outside, night sounds continued. Frogs, crickets, the distant call of an owl hunting. He studied each name on the list, remembered each face from the trial, remembered who'd smiled when the verdict was read, who'd cheered when the sentence was pronounced, who'd volunteered to build the gallows that was supposed to end his life. The knife grew sharper with each stroke. His movements remained steady, patient. This wasn't rage. This was accounting, an audit of debts owed, a balancing of books that had been kept falsified for far too long. He set down the whetstone, tested the blade's edge against his thumb. Sharp enough. Everything was sharp enough now. The tools, the plans, the purpose. His voice emerged as barely a whisper. Words meant for no audience but himself, and whatever witnesses existed in the realm between justice and judgment. You wrote my sentence. He drew a second line through Sheriff Crow's name, making it permanent, confirming the completion. Now I write yours. The charcoal moved to the next name on the list. Nightfall came different now. Used to be Dunwich Crossing settled into comfortable darkness. Familiar sounds, known rhythms, the predictable peace of a town that believed itself untouchable. Not anymore. Judge Greeley's mansion blazed with lamplight from every window. The house crowned the hill like a warning beacon. Armed men walked its perimeter in pairs, rifles across their chests. More guards stationed themselves at the gate, at the road approaches, at every possible entry point. The judge stood at his second-floor study window, watched the town spread below him. Other homes had followed his example. Lights burning, men armed, families huddled inside like prey waiting for the hunter to strike. Samuel paced behind him. Still wanted action, still believed force could solve what was happening. We should burn the quarters completely, he argued. Drive them all out. Make it impossible for anyone to hide among them. The quarters are already burned, the judge reminded him. Already empty? You'd be torching abandoned buildings while our real enemy watches and laughs. Then we search the woods, send tracking parties, into terrain they know better than us. At night, you'd be sending men to die. Samuel slammed a book off the desk. So, we just sit here? Wait for him to come for us? The judge turned from the window. His face looked older in the lamplight. Lines deeper. Eyes tired. For perhaps the first time in his life, Horace Greeley appeared uncertain. We survive until help arrives. The telegraph will be repaired. Word will reach Jackson. They'll send troops to restore order. And if he strikes before then? The question hung unanswered. Both men knew the truth. Whoever hunted them had already demonstrated superior planning, superior execution, superior patience. The kind of enemy who didn't make mistakes because he'd spent years preparing for this exact situation. Down in the streets, armed patrols walked nervous routes. White shopkeepers, farmers, men who'd spent their lives enforcing casual terror, now experiencing what it felt like to be terrorized. They jumped at sounds, pointed guns at shadows, saw threats in every dark corner. The whispers had started by evening, spread like fever through the frightened population. It's the ghost of the gallows, the man we burned. Come back. Divine judgment for our sins. The judge heard them even from his hilltop fortress, heard how quickly his ordered society collapsed into superstition when fear replaced certainty. All his speeches about law, about civilization, about hierarchy and natural order, revealed as nothing more than comfortable lies people told themselves when they held power. Midnight approached. The patrols continued. The lights stayed burning. The town held its collective breath. 3 miles out, in different locations surrounding Dunwich Crossing, groups of men prepared for coordinated action. Not random violence, not panicked destruction, precise military operations executed by people who'd been training for weeks. Former soldiers, freedmen who'd fought for the Union, men who understood tactics and timing, led by someone who'd studied every weakness in the town's defenses, who knew which roads mattered, which supplies were critical, which targets would create maximum disruption with minimum bloodshed. The first group moved on the remaining bridges, loaded wagons with barrels of lamp oil, set them ablaze and sent them rolling onto wooden spans. 3 bridges connecting Dunwich Crossing to neighboring counties, all burning simultaneously, cutting off reinforcement routes, isolating the town further. The second group struck supply depots, food storage, medicine, the emergency reserves the town kept for disaster, not destroyed completely, just made inaccessible. Doors barred from outside, windows blocked, forcing the defenders to waste time and manpower breaking into their own supplies. The third group freed prisoners from the temporary jail the town had established after Sheriff Crow's death. Mostly black men arrested on suspicion, held without charges, without evidence, released them with simple instructions. Run! Don't stop! Don't look back. Each operation completed in minutes. No prolonged engagement, no unnecessary confrontation. Strike and withdraw. Achieve the objective and disappear before resistance could organize. Elias himself moved with the fourth group. 10 men, veterans all. They approached from the south where the terrain was roughest, where overconfident guards had thinned their patrols, believing the swamp provided natural protection. They carried torches, not for light, for purpose. The courthouse stood at the town's center, the restored symbol of Judge Greeley's authority, rebuilt after the fire that had freed Elias 5 years ago. Improved with better materials, stronger foundations, a monument to the permanence of the existing order. Elias studied it from the tree line, watched guards patrol its perimeter, counted their numbers, timed their rotations, found the gaps in their coverage the way a surgeon finds veins to cut. His men spread out. Each knew their role. Each understood the objective wasn't killing. It was erasure, making the symbols of power vanish like morning fog under sunlight. The first torch landed on the roof, then another, then 5 more in quick succession. Not the walls, not the ground level where guards could respond. The roof, the highest point. Let gravity work for them as fire always wanted to climb. By the time guards noticed, flames had already spread, too high to reach, too established to stop with buckets. The courthouse roof became an inferno visible across the entire county. Alarm bells rang. Men shouted. Patrols converged on the burning building, exactly as planned, drawing defenders away from other positions, creating confusion, splitting their response. While they fought the courthouse fire, other buildings ignited. The mayor's office, the records hall, the bank where land deeds were stored. Each one a repository of the systems that maintained injustice. Each one chosen deliberately for what it represented, rather than what it contained. Elias watched from the courthouse steps as dawn approached. Flames painted the sky orange and red. Smoke rolled through streets like fog. Men ran everywhere and accomplished nothing. Their organized society reduced to chaos within hours. The screaming had been minimal. Most people smart enough to flee, to abandon property in favor of survival. To recognize this wasn't random violence, but targeted elimination of specific structures. After each scream came silence, the quiet of history being rewritten, of old orders burning away to make room for something different. Not necessarily better, just different. The scales balanced through destruction because they'd never been balanced through justice. Ashes fell like snow around him, gray flakes drifting down to coat everything. The town, his clothes, his upturned face. He stood motionless as the courthouse collapsed behind him. Timbers cracking, walls folding inward. The gallows beam that had been repurposed into stairs, now consumed again by fire. His voice emerged quiet, thoughtful, not triumphant, not vengeful, simply stating fact. It's not vengeance. It's memory correcting itself. The courthouse foundation glowed red with retained heat. Nothing would rebuild there. The ground itself was too scorched, too marked by what had occurred. Future generations would avoid this spot the way animals avoided places where many died. Elias turned north, toward the hill, toward the mansion still blazing with defensive light, toward the last name on his list that mattered. The judge, the architect, the man who'd pronounced sentence with such certainty, who'd called it justice when it was murder, who'd hidden behind law when committing evil. His final destination waited. Dawn light crept through smoke, painted everything gray and orange. The town below barely existed anymore. Fires still burned in isolated pockets. Buildings stood as skeletal frames. The careful order Judge Greeley had maintained for decades reduced to ash and memory. Inside the mansion, the judge had retreated to his study, his sanctuary, the room where he'd written countless sentences, composed speeches about law and civilization, convinced himself that his authority came from something higher than mere violence. Law books lined every wall, leather-bound volumes he'd collected over 40 years, precedents and statutes, the accumulated wisdom of legal tradition. He'd pulled several down from their shelves, built small barriers around his desk, as if words on pages could stop what was coming. Whiskey bottles stood among the books, 3 empty, 1 half full. He'd been drinking since the courthouse fire became visible, since he understood that everything he'd built was being systematically dismantled, since he recognized that the hunter had finally come for him. His hands shook, made the glass rattle against the bottleneck when he poured, spilled amber liquid across legal texts that had once seemed so important, so permanent, so true. Samuel had fled hours ago, taken horses, and rode hard for Jackson with a handful of loyal men, left his father to face whatever came alone. The judge didn't blame him, understood that survival mattered more than loyalty when the foundation crumbled. The remaining guards had abandoned their posts when the town center burned, ran to save their own families, their own property, left the mansion undefended except for locked doors and the judge's increasingly desperate faith that his position would somehow protect him. It wouldn't. He knew that now, understood it with the clarity whiskey sometimes provided. All his speeches about divine order, about natural hierarchy, about justice as the foundation of civilization, revealed as nothing more than comfortable justifications for maintaining power through terror. The front door opened downstairs. No crash, no forced entry, just the quiet click of a lock being turned. Footsteps in the entrance hall. Measured, unhurried. The confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they would do when they arrived. Judge Greeley stood. His legs barely supported him, tried to steady himself against the desk. knocked over the whiskey bottle, watched it spread across papers that contained his life's work, his legacy, the careful documentation of a career built on sending men to die. The footsteps climbed the stairs, each step distinct, each one bringing the reckoning closer. The judge's breath came in short gasps, his heart hammered. For the first time in his life, Horace Greeley understood what terror felt like, what his victims had experienced when they stood before his bench, when they heard his sentences pronounced with absolute certainty. The study door opened slowly, revealed a figure backlit by the hall's remaining lamp. Tall, solid, patient, features obscured by smoke and shadow until he stepped fully into the room. Elias Carter stood before him, 5 years older than the man who'd escaped the gallows, harder, changed by time and purpose, but unmistakably the same person the judge had sentenced to death. The ghost made flesh. The dead man who refused to stay, buried. Their eyes met. Judge and condemned. Authority and victim. Roles reversed, but recognition complete. The judge's mouth opened, but no words emerged. What could he say? What argument could he make that would matter now? Elias spoke first, his voice quiet, controlled, free of rage, simply stating facts that needed acknowledgement. You told my mother I was serving divine justice, that my death would balance the scales, that you spoke for God and law. The judge tried to respond. His voice cracked. I was wrong. I see that now. I can make amends. No. Elias stepped forward. You can't. Some things can't be amended, can't be apologized away, can only be balanced. He gestured toward the door. Walk. Please. Walk. Or I carry you. Choose. The judge stumbled forward. His legs barely functioned. Whiskey and fear turned his muscles to water. Elias followed 3 steps behind, close enough to catch him if he fell, far enough to prevent any desperate attack. They descended the stairs, crossed through rooms the judge had filled with expensive furniture. Symbols of his status, his importance, all meaningless now, just objects, waiting to burn, like everything else. Outside, the air tasted of smoke and coming rain. The eastern sky showed hints of morning, pink and gold beneath the gray pall. Birds had started calling despite the devastation. Nature indifferent to human suffering, to human justice, to anything except its own endless cycles. Behind the mansion, the judge had built something he called history, a replica gallows constructed from the original wood, salvaged from the courthouse after the fire, rebuilt on his property as a monument, a reminder of his authority, his right to pronounce death. He'd shown it to visitors with pride, explained how justice required visible symbols, how punishment must be displayed to maintain order, how the gallows represented civilization's triumph over savagery. Now it waited for him, the rope already prepared, the trap-door mechanism still functional. Everything ready as if this moment had been inevitable from the instant he'd pronounced Elias's original sentence. Elias guided him forward, up the 13 steps, onto the platform where condemned men stood, where they faced their final moments before the floor dropped away. The judge's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing, begging, all dignity abandoned in the face of mortality. Please, please, I was only enforcing the law. Doing my duty. You can't. Stand up. Elias's voice remained calm, factual. You don't get to kneel. They weren't allowed to kneel. Neither are you. He hauled the judge to his feet, positioned him on the trap door, placed the noose around his neck with practiced efficiency. The judge whimpered, tried to speak, couldn't form words through the terror choking him worse than any rope. Elias pulled out a folded paper from his coat, opened it, handed it to the trembling man. The judge's own handwriting, his original sentence, the document that condemned Elias Carter to death, preserved all these years, waiting for this exact purpose. "Read it," Elias commanded. "Every word, exactly as you wrote it." The judge's hands shook so badly he could barely hold the paper. His voice emerged in broken whispers. "Elias Carter is hereby sentenced to death by hanging, for the crime of murder. Louder. You spoke louder when you meant it. Sentenced to death by hanging." The words came out as screams. "May God have mercy on his soul. This sentence to be carried out at dawn." Dawn light broke over the hill, painted everything gold. Perfect timing. Divine or coincidental. Didn't matter which. Elias took the paper back, folded it carefully, returned it to his coat, met the judge's eyes one final time, spoke softly, almost gently. "Then, by your law, justice is served." He stepped back, pulled the lever. The trap door opened. The rope went taut, made that distinctive creak of fiber under sudden weight. The sound of sentences being executed, of balances being corrected, of history writing its final entry. Elias didn't watch, didn't need to. The sound told him everything. He walked back into the mansion. Through rooms already beginning to smoke, fire had found the foundation, started its patient work of consuming everything the Greeleys had built. He emerged from the front entrance as the mansion's roof caught, flames visible through upper windows, the structure groaning as heat weakened supports. Soon it would collapse completely. Bury the gallows, bury the judge, bury the entire legacy under ash and ruin. The town bell began to toll. Someone still alive, still capable of pulling the rope. Each strike echoed across the empty square, across abandoned streets, across the smoking remains of what had been Dunwich Crossing. Elias walked toward the sound, through smoke that swirled around him like fog, each toll marking his passage, counting out the dead, the judged, the balanced scales written in fire and ash. His shadow stretched long behind him in the rising sun, followed him down the hill, away from the burning mansion, into the empty heart of the town he'd erased. The morning came soft. Gray light filtered through smoke that still drifted across what remained of Dunwich Crossing. The air tasted of ash and rain. Moisture hung thick, but refused to fall, as if the sky itself waited to see what would happen next. Buildings stood as skeletal frames. Charred beams reached toward clouds like black fingers. The courthouse, rebuilt after the first fire, existed now as scattered stones and twisted metal. The gallows hill showed nothing but scorched earth, where the mansion had burned through the night, collapsed completely just before dawn, buried everything beneath itself. People emerged from hiding places as morning grew, crawled from root cellars and storm shelters, from the woods beyond town limits, from anywhere they'd fled when the fires started. They walked through streets they no longer recognized, stepped carefully around debris that had been their lives. Most survivors were white. The black quarters had burned days ago. Those who'd lived there had already fled or died. The few who remained moved like shadows, kept to themselves, avoided eye contact. Survival required invisibility now more than ever. No one spoke much. Shock stole words, made conversation impossible. They simply wandered, searching for familiar landmarks, for anything that proved this place had once been home, finding nothing but destruction everywhere they looked. The general store existed as a foundation and ash. The telegraph office showed 4 walls standing but no roof, no equipment, nothing functional. The church bell tower had fallen, crushed the pews beneath it. Stained glass windows melted into colorful slag that pooled between broken stones. Samuel Greeley hadn't returned. Neither had the men who'd fled with him. Probably wouldn't ever return. Not to this, not to ruins that held no power, no profit, no future worth claiming. Some survivors started asking questions, trying to understand, making sense of chaos through whatever explanation felt comfortable. Most blamed the ghost. The dead man who refused to stay buried. The spirit seeking revenge. Easier to believe in haunting than to acknowledge the systematic destruction of everything they'd built on stolen land and broken bodies. Elias Carter stood on the riverbank where he'd collapsed 5 years ago. The same mud, the same current, the same willows trailing branches in brown water. Everything familiar, but transformed by time and purpose, by what he'd become in the years between escape and return. Soot covered him completely, darkened his skin further, turned his clothes gray and stiff. He limped slightly, left ankle swollen from a beam that had fallen too close, caught him while he moved through the burning mill. Nothing broken, just bruised, just another mark to add to scars he'd collected. He pulled off his gloves, leather burned in places, cracked from heat and use. Stiff with dried sweat and ash. They'd served their purpose, protected his hands while he worked, while he pulled levers and set fires and unmade the town piece by piece. The current moved steady, patient. It would carry the gloves away, toward the Mississippi eventually, out to the Gulf, into water so vast they'd disappear completely, leave no trace of the hands that wore them or the work those hands accomplished. He dropped them, watched them float, turned slowly in eddies before the current claimed them properly, pulled them downstream, past the landing where boats once docked, past the place where children used to swim, gone in moments, swallowed by brown water and distance. Footsteps behind him, light, hesitant, a child approaching, maybe 7 or 8 years old, dirty face, torn clothes, eyes too wide with things they'd seen, things no child should witness, but life showed them anyway. The boy stopped a few feet back, watched Elias carefully, gathering courage to speak. Finally managed words in a voice that trembled slightly. "Are you the man they say can't die?" Elias turned, studied the child. White boy with blonde hair darkened by soot. Missing his family, probably, separated in the chaos, looking for answers, for understanding, for anything that made sense when nothing else did. He smiled faintly. The expression felt strange on his face, unused muscles remembering how after years of grimness, of focus so complete, the joy became impossible. But the question deserved gentleness, deserved truth, spoken plainly. "No," he said, his voice rough from smoke, from shouting orders through burning buildings, from breathing air thick with ash. "I'm the man who finally lived." The boy processed this, tried to understand, failed probably. How could a child grasp the difference between survival and living, between breathing and purpose, between existing and becoming fully human through action? Where will you go? The question simple, practical. The concern of someone who understood displacement, who knew leaving came next. Elias looked toward the horizon, east first, where morning light grew stronger, then south, then north, 3 directions offering possibility, offering distance from what he'd done, what he'd unmade, what he'd balanced through fire and rope. "Somewhere new," he said. "Somewhere that doesn't know my name." "What about here?" "Here is finished." He gestured at the ruins, at smoke still rising from collapsed buildings, at the empty streets and wandering survivors. "Here has to start over. Build something different. Or stay dead. Not my choice anymore." The boy nodded, seemed to accept this, turned and walked back toward the town center, probably searching for parents, for siblings, for anyone familiar in the destruction. Elias watched him go, small figure disappearing into gray smoke. Another survivor, another person who'd carry stories forward, who'd tell children someday about the ghost who couldn't die, the man who destroyed Dunwich Crossing, the legend that would grow and change and become something other than truth. He turned back to the river. Let the current hypnotize him briefly. Steady movement that never stopped. never questioned, just flowed according to laws older than human justice, older than revenge, older than everything except Earth itself. His reflection showed in the water, distorted by ripples, by movement. A face he barely recognized, changed so completely from the sharecropper who'd stood in court 5 years ago, from the man who'd believed in justice, who'd thought law meant something beyond power. That man had died in the fire, or maybe on the gallows that never claimed him, or maybe gradually over years of planning, of watching, of becoming something harder and colder and more focused than any human should be. This man, this Elias who remained, felt empty, hollow. Purpose fulfilled left nothing behind except exhaustion and the question of what came next, of who he'd be now that vengeance no longer defined him. He stepped away from the bank, began walking, not toward town, not back to witness what he'd done, but parallel to the river, following its course north, toward Memphis maybe, toward St. Louis, toward anywhere that offered distance and anonymity and the possibility of rebuilding himself into someone who could live without rage. Smoke rose behind him, thick columns marking where Dunwich Crossing burned itself out, where history erased itself through flames, where scales balanced through destruction so complete that even memory might eventually fail. His shadow stretched long in morning light, followed him through grass still wet with dew, through fields that would grow over the town's ruins, would reclaim the land for wilderness, for nature's patient work of forgetting human constructions. He didn't look back, didn't need final glimpses, carried everything important inside already. The weight of what he'd done, the knowledge of what it cost, the understanding that justice and revenge might share the same face, but never the same soul. The river flowed beside him, constant companion, leading him forward into whatever came next. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.